The sirens had not yet faded when the factory whistles began. It was always that way in 1941, the rhythm of Britain's heart beating between danger and duty. Across the darkened streets of Coventry, figures in overalls hurried through the smoke, their footsteps echoing in puddles left by the night's rain. The air still smelled faintly of burning. Windows were patched with cardboard, glass impossible to come by. Yet inside the vast sheds of the munitions plant, the machines already roared to life, iron lungs breathing for a nation under siege. Margaret Holloway tied her scarf tighter around her hair, the ends tucked neatly beneath her chin. She was 23, once a typist, now a lathe operator. Her hands, once soft and careful, were calloused from months of steel dust and heat. The whistle blew again, and the day began. Beside her, an older woman named Elsie adjusted her safety goggles, grinning. "Another fine day in paradise," she said. Margaret smiled faintly. "If paradise smells like oil and fear." They laughed, but the laughter was thin. Every hour, news came from the front. Ships sunk in the Atlantic, men lost over France, bombers downed. The women did not talk about the numbers anymore. They only worked faster. Each turn of the lathe mattered. Each shell casing, each gear, each bullet was a heartbeat on the front lines. Margaret had learned to measure her days not in hours, but in output. 100 shells before lunch, another 100 before dusk. The floor supervisor, a former railway engineer, too old for service, moved among them like a conductor keeping tempo. "Smooth hands, steady pace," he called out. "These aren't just bolts and barrels. They're promises to the men out there." At night, when the shift ended and the blackout curtains were drawn, Margaret would walk home through the dim streets, where every sound seemed amplified. The city had been hit hard 2 weeks earlier. Rubble still lined the pavements, the smell of ash never quite gone. She passed a row of houses where children slept in cellars, their toys still on shelves upstairs, untouched since autumn. In one window, a small candle flickered beside a photograph of a man in uniform. Every street had one. Every home had someone away. Her own brother, Thomas, was in the RAF, a mechanic on a bomber squadron stationed near Norwich. He wrote once a week when he could, his letters smudged with grease and rain. "Keep doing your bit, Maggie," he wrote in one. "Without you lot, we'd be throwing rocks at the enemy." She kept that letter folded in her pocket, the edges worn smooth by her fingers. It was her charm, her proof that the noise and sweat and aching muscles meant something. Rationing ruled everything. Tea was precious, sugar sacred. There was never enough of anything, but somehow it was enough. Margaret had learned to make meals from nothing. A spoon of powdered egg, a heel of bread, a miracle of imagination. Elsie joked that the Ministry of Food should give medals to mothers before soldiers. Yet despite the shortages, there was a strange sense of unity. In the canteen, women shared whatever they could. An apple slice, a pinch of salt, a story. They sang sometimes as they worked, their voices barely rising above the machines. Then came December. The cold bit through the walls, and the nights grew longer. The raids intensified. The factories were prime targets now. One evening, the sirens wailed just as the night shift began. Instead of running for the shelters, the women kept working. "We're not stopping," shouted Elsie over the noise. "They'll not scare us off." The floor trembled as bombs fell somewhere to the west. The lights flickered. Margaret's heart pounded, but her hands never stopped turning the lathe. In that moment, she understood something. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing your job while the world tried to fall apart around you. When dawn came, half the city was gone. Smoke hung low over the ruins, and the sound of distant sirens faded into silence. The factory stood, scarred but standing. Margaret walked home past craters and shattered houses. She found her street unrecognizable. The house next door was gone entirely. Her own door hung off its hinges. Her mother was safe, bruised but alive, standing in the garden clutching a kettle. "It's gone, love," she said softly. But we're still here. Margaret looked around. Rubble where neighbors had lived. The faint smell of gas and dust. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she took her mother's hand. Then we start again, and they did. By the new year, the city was rebuilding. The factory roof was patched, the machines humming once more. The government posters said keep calm and carry on. But Margaret didn't need reminding. Carrying on was all she knew. She joined the volunteer fire service at night, pulling survivors from debris when the raids came, her overalls streaked with soot and tears. Sleep became a luxury, yet somehow she felt more alive than ever. The war had stripped away everything unnecessary, comfort, vanity, even fear. All that remained was purpose. By 1942, the war stretched across the world, and so did its workers. Across the ocean, in America, a different kind of war effort was rising. In Detroit, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, factories that once built cars and appliances now forged engines, tanks, and bombers. The noise was constant, a thunder of progress. Rosie the Riveter smiled from posters, sleeves rolled, jaw set with determination. "We can do it," the slogan said, and millions believed it. In one such factory in Michigan, a young woman named Clara Jenkins wiped sweat from her brow and adjusted her bandana. She had never worked a machine before 1942. Before the war, she'd been a waitress, her hands trained for coffee cups and menus, not rivet guns. But now, with her husband overseas and her brothers drafted, she stood on the assembly line beside hundreds of other women, their hands blackened by oil, their hearts steady. "You'd never think we'd be building B-24s, she said to her friend Ruth one morning, shouting over the hammering noise. "I used to be scared of ladders. Now I'm climbing wing scaffolds." Ruth grinned, eyes bright behind her goggles. "War changes more than borders, honey. It changes us." The plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Men supervised at first, but soon the women became the experts. They learned to read blueprints, fix engines, troubleshoot hydraulic lines. Inspectors came by expecting mistakes and left impressed. Clara found pride in the precision. Each rivet a piece of protection, each panel a promise that her husband might come home safe. "We're not just working," she told Ruth. "We're fighting our own war." Rationing came to America too. Gasoline, rubber, coffee. Everything was limited. But instead of despair, there was determination. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and empty lots. Children collected scrap metal. Women knitted socks for soldiers. Neighbors shared recipes that made miracles out of powdered milk. Across every kitchen and every town hall, the war became personal. Clara received her first telegram in 1943. Her husband's unit had gone missing after the landing in Sicily. For 2 weeks, she said nothing, showing up for her shift each day as if nothing had happened. Only when the second telegram arrived, found alive, recovering in hospital, did she break down. Her co-workers gathered around her, holding her close, their faces streaked with sweat and tears. "You see?" said Ruth softly. "We build them wings, and somehow they find a way to fly home." That night, Clara went home and opened the small box she kept on her dresser. Inside was her husband's photograph, a folded flag patch, and a tiny metal rivet she'd saved from her first day at the plant. She placed the photo beside it, whispering, "This is how I fight for you." Back in Britain, Margaret's world had changed too. The war dragged on into its 5th year. She was now a supervisor, responsible for 40 workers, mostly young women barely out of school. They worked through exhaustion, through loss, through endless nights of thunder and flame. Yet they laughed when they could, finding light in small things, a joke, a song, a shared cup of tea brewed from reused leaves. One evening, she received a letter in a different handwriting. It was from her brother's commanding officer. Thomas's aircraft had gone missing over the North Sea. The words blurred as she read. No survivors reported. She folded the letter carefully, hands trembling, and went to work the next morning without a word. When Elsie asked if she was all right, Margaret simply said, "If I stop, I'll never start again." That night, she stayed long after the others had gone, standing by the machines in the dim light. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, and for a moment, she thought she could hear her brother's laughter among the sounds. She placed the letter in her pocket and whispered, "For you, Tom, for all of them." Then she turned the lathe back on, the noise drowning out everything but the rhythm of survival. The war would continue, shifting tides and turning fortunes, but in every nation, on every street, and in every home, there were people like Margaret and Clara. People who built and bled and believed that their labor, unseen and unglamorous, mattered as much as any battle. They didn't fire the guns or fly the planes, yet their fingerprints were on every victory. They kept the world alive while the world was at war. By the spring of 1944, the air was thick with rumor. Something big was coming. Everyone knew it, though no one said it out loud. The factory talk circled like whispers in the wind. An invasion, a landing, the beginning of the end. Margaret could feel it in the way the orders doubled overnight, the way the government inspectors came more often, watching every bolt, every shell. The war had a pulse, and it was quickening. The women in the Coventry plant worked without rest. Meals were taken standing, eyes heavy from sleepless nights. Yet no one complained. They had learned to find pride in exhaustion, in grease-streaked faces and aching backs. Margaret had lost count of how many bombs and shells her team had built. She no longer thought of them as weapons, but as the only bridge between survival and defeat. One evening, as the shift ended, Elsie handed her a small folded paper. "Read it when you're alone," she said, smiling faintly. Inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "For my boy, who never came home, I work for yours." Margaret folded the note slowly, her throat tight. The war had taken so much, yet somehow it had bound them closer than family. In the weeks that followed, the raids grew less frequent. The Luftwaffe was losing strength, but no one dared believe it meant safety. The sky was still a threat. But in the silence between air raids, Margaret began to hear something new. The distant hum of bombers not bringing death to England, but carrying it across the Channel. Hope, cautious and trembling, began to rise. Then came June. News of the landings spread through the factory like fire. Normandy, beaches, paratroopers, endless columns of ships. They didn't hear it from the radio first. They heard it in the tone of the officers who came through the doors, the urgency in their steps. "They've gone in," someone whispered. The machines kept running, but the rhythm had changed. Each hammer strike seemed to echo with the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end. Margaret worked late that night, unable to leave. When she stepped outside near midnight, the streets were quiet except for the distant rumble of planes heading south. She looked up at the faint glimmer of stars behind the clouds and whispered, "Go on, lads. We've done our part. Bring it home." Across the Atlantic, the noise of industry was thunderous. Clara's factory in Michigan had reached full production. The plant floor glowed under fluorescent lights, endless rows of women driving rivets into the wings of bombers bound for Europe. The sound was deafening, but to Clara it was the sound of purpose. Her husband, James, was back on his feet now, recovered from his wounds and awaiting reassignment. His letters came more often, full of cautious optimism. "They say the boys have landed in France," he wrote in June. "If that's true, maybe we'll be home by Christmas. Keep building those planes, darling. I might fly one of them yet." Clara smiled every time she read it. She could almost hear his voice in the words, smell the faint scent of engine oil that used to cling to his hands. Every rivet she drove now felt personal. She worked faster, longer, as if her hands could shorten the war by sheer will. In town, rationing grew tighter. Gasoline was nearly impossible to get. Even the simplest items, butter, coffee, stockings, were rare treasures. Yet no one complained. Victory meant more than comfort. The community held dances on weekends in the school gym. Soldiers home on leave twirling women in factory uniforms. Laughter mixing with the music of a brass band. Clara went once, wearing her best dress patched 3 times over. A soldier she didn't know asked her to dance, and for a brief moment she felt 20 again. The war forgotten, the world alive. But the illusion never lasted long. Each Monday brought fresh lists of casualties, new faces missing from the line. Ruth's younger brother was killed in Italy. The next day, Ruth came to work as usual. She said nothing, only worked harder. The grief of millions was poured into the engines of war. Each tear turned into steel, each heartbreak into strength. As the summer of 1944 burned on, the Allies pushed across France. Factories buzzed day and night. The air smelled of hot metal and sweat. Clara began training younger girls who'd just joined the workforce. Girls of 16 and 17, eager, quick, full of nervous laughter. "You'll get used to the noise," she told them. "It's the sound of freedom being built." By September, rumors of victory felt closer. Paris had been liberated. Newsreels showed crowds cheering in the streets, soldiers tossing their caps in the air. The women in the plant stopped work for 5 minutes that day, standing in silence as the foreman turned up the radio. The voice crackled through static. "Paris is free." For the first time in years, Clara wept without shame. But the war was not done. Across Europe, cities still burned. In the east, the Soviets clawed their way toward Berlin at unimaginable cost. In the Pacific, the fighting grew fiercer than ever. Yet everywhere, behind every front, civilians kept the machine turning. In Britain, Margaret's factory shifted production once again. Now they were building landing craft engines and replacement tank parts. She had become something of a legend among her workers, calm even under fire, stern but fair. When the first American supplies began to arrive under the Lend-Lease program, she marveled at their quality. "Our cousins across the sea know their stuff," she said to Elsie. "Wouldn't mind shaking the hand of one of those women building these engines." She didn't know that. Across an ocean, one of them was Clara, a woman just like her, whose hands bore the same scars, whose eyes carried the same quiet determination. They would never meet, but together they were shaping the same destiny. Then came the winter of 1944. One last trial. The Battle of the Bulge raged in the frozen forests of Belgium. Supplies were stretched, losses heavy. Factories were pushed to their limits. Margaret's team worked through Christmas, their decorations nothing more than paper stars cut from ration cards and tinsel made of wire scrap. They sang carols under the hum of the generators, their voices soft but unbroken. When word came that the German counterattack had failed, the cheer that went up was not loud but deep, a long, weary sigh of relief that came from the soul. The end was near now. They could feel it. In early 1945, Clara received her final letter from James. He was flying missions over Germany, the last desperate strikes of a dying regime. "I'll be home soon," he wrote. "When you see the factories go quiet, that's how you'll know it's over." She kept that letter close to her heart. And then, one gray morning in May, it happened. The radio crackled to life before dawn. The words came slow, solemn, disbelieving. "Germany has surrendered." Margaret was on the factory floor when the announcement came. For a moment, no one moved. The machines hummed on, unaware. Then, one by one, the sound stopped. The engines, the hammers, the drills. Silence filled the room, strange and heavy. Then Elsie began to cry, her hands over her face, and the rest followed. They hugged, they laughed, they shouted through tears. The war that had consumed 6 years of their lives was finally over. That night, Coventry was alive again. Lights shone through windows uncovered for the first time in years. Music drifted through the streets. People danced among the ruins, holding hands, kissing strangers, shouting names of loved ones who might yet come home. Margaret stood in the square, looking up at the sky. There were no bombers now, only stars. "We made it," she whispered. "We actually made it." Across the ocean, Clara heard the same news. The factory sirens that had always signaled danger now wailed for joy. Workers climbed on tables, throwing their caps in the air. The foreman stood by the loudspeaker, unable to speak for a long moment. Then he simply said, "You did it, girls. You built victory." Clara went home that night and waited by the radio for James's voice. When it came weeks later, crackly, distant but real, she wept so hard she could barely breathe. "I'm coming home," he said. "We did it, Clara. You and me, both sides of the ocean. Sides of the ocean." Months later, when the factories began to close and life slowly returned to something like peace, both women found themselves adrift. The war had given them purpose, and now the silence felt strange. Margaret took a job teaching new apprentices at a local engineering school, determined to show that women could do more than anyone had ever imagined. Clara became a mechanic in a small garage, the first woman in her town to do so. The war had changed them forever. Neither of them ever forgot the sound of the machines, the smell of oil, the feeling of being part of something greater than themselves. They had built more than weapons. They had built history. The factories did not fall silent overnight. For weeks after the surrender, the machines still turned, though slower now, uncertain of their purpose. The clang of steel on steel no longer spoke of urgency, but of habit, a rhythm that had carried them through years of fear and loss. Margaret still walked to the plant every morning, though the air felt different, lighter, quieter. On the first Monday of peace, she stood by her lathe and listened to the hum of the motors, the faint echo of thousands of days spent in that same sound. Then, for the first time in years, she turned it off. The silence was almost unbearable. Outside, Coventry was waking up again. The ruins were still there, but so were the flowers. Poppies sprouted through cracks in the pavements, as if the earth itself had decided to remember. The church bells rang for the first time since 1939. Their sound mingling with the laughter of children who no longer needed to run to shelters. People smiled again, unsure how to begin living without the shadow of the siren. The city was a scar, but it was alive. Margaret found herself walking without destination. The war had defined every step of her life since she was 23, and now, at 28, she felt both old and new. She passed a street where her brother used to play football as a boy. Now nothing but rubble and grass. In her pocket, she still carried his last letter. Sometimes she took it out and read it aloud to no one. "Keep doing your bit, Maggie," he had written. "Without you lot, we'd be throwing rocks." She smiled faintly through tears. "I did, Tom," she whispered. "We all did. The government promised rebuilding, new jobs, new homes. But the transition was not easy. Factories began to close or retool for peacetime. Men returned from the front to find women in the positions they had once held. Some were grateful, others resentful. There were awkward silences in canteens, unspoken tensions in workshops. Margaret saw women who had kept the nation alive being told to step aside, to return to normal. But what was normal now? The war had remade them all. One morning, the plant manager called a meeting. Production was ending. "We're moving to civilian work," he announced. "Those who wish to stay can apply for retraining. Others will be laid off with recommendation." A murmur spread through the hall. Margaret felt a pang of fear. Not of unemployment, but of losing purpose. For years, her hands had built life out of destruction. What would she build now? Elsie came up beside her, holding a tin mug of tea. "Well, love," she said, "looks like we'll have to find another way to save the world." Margaret smiled. Maybe we already did. She applied for the retraining program and months later found herself in a classroom full of young men learning to operate new precision machines. Some looked skeptical when she walked in. A woman teaching them? But by the end of the first week, they watched her with respect. Her hands, though rough, moved with the grace of experience. "You see," she said once, demonstrating the fine art of lathe balance, "it's not about force. It's about feel. You have to listen to the steel." One of her students, barely 19, raised a hand. "How did you learn that?" She paused, smiled softly, and said, "In the war, the steel used to talk to us louder then." Meanwhile, across the ocean, the same transformation was happening in America. The war plants began to close, one by one. The women who had built bombers and tanks were told to go home, to make room for the returning soldiers. Some did, others couldn't. Clara was among the latter. She had grown to love the rhythm of work, the camaraderie, the knowledge that her hands could shape something strong and lasting. When the factory gates finally shut for good, she stood there for a long time, her lunch pail in her hand, staring at the silent hangars. The sign outside still read, "Willow Run Bomber Plant," but the letters were fading. Ruth came up beside her, eyes distant. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Clara nodded. "Like the world's moving on without us." Ruth sighed. Maybe it's our turn to rest. But Clara couldn't rest. She found a job in a small garage on the edge of town, fixing engines, changing oil, repairing the trucks of farmers who looked at her with surprise the first time she wiped her hands on a rag and said, "You're good to go." It wasn't easy. Some refused her service at first, saying it wasn't work for a lady. But word spread quickly. She was better than most men in town. Before long, they came willingly, hats in hand, asking for her help. At night, when she closed the shop, she'd sit by the radio with James, listening to reports of rebuilding in Europe, of nations rising from ashes. He still carried scars from the war, but his eyes softened when he looked at her. "You kept the home front running, Clara," he said once. "You were my reason to come back," she smiled. "And you were my reason to keep working." In 1946, the government invited women like Clara to speak at schools and rallies about their wartime experiences. She went reluctantly, standing before rows of young girls in bright dresses. "They called us Rosies," she told them, "but we weren't heroes. We just did what had to be done. And we learned that once you've built a bomber, there's nothing in the world you can't build again." The girls clapped, but Clara saw something deeper in their eyes. A spark of belief that they could do anything. Back in Britain, Margaret received a letter from the Ministry of Labor. Her name had been submitted for an award for exceptional service to wartime production. She almost laughed when she read it. She didn't want medals. The real reward, she thought, was standing in a classroom full of apprentices, watching them take her lessons and shape them into something new. The years rolled on. Peace brought its own challenges. Shortages, rationing that lingered, political debates, and the slow rebuilding of lives. But there was also music again, and laughter, and hope. Children played in the streets. Men repaired houses instead of tanks. Women who had worked beside roaring furnaces now pushed prams or typed in offices, their hands never forgetting the weight of a spanner or the vibration of machinery. Every year, on the anniversary of the war's end, Margaret would visit the cathedral ruins in Coventry. Flowers were always laid there, red, white, blue. She would place a small steel bolt among them, one she had kept from the factory's last day of production. "For those who built what could not be seen," she would whisper. In America, Clara did the same in her own way. On Victory Day, she would open the garage early, hang a flag out front, and play Glenn Miller on the old gramophone. The customers would stop, smile, and say, "You were one of them, weren't you?" She would nod quietly and reply, "One of many." As the decades passed, the world changed again. New wars, new machines, New generations who only knew the Second World War from books and films. But in the quiet corners of old towns, in workshops and classrooms, the memory of those civilians, those women and men who had built victory from dust and sweat, lingered. They had not fought on battlefields, but they had fought in spirit. They had turned factories into fortresses and labor into courage. In her old age, Margaret received a letter from a young historian who had found her name in the archives of wartime production records. He wanted to interview her for a documentary. "We want to tell your story," he wrote. She laughed softly when she read it. "My story?" she said aloud. "There were millions of us. Mine's just one note in a song." But she agreed. When the cameras came, she sat by her window, the afternoon sun lighting her lined face. The interviewer asked, "What kept you going during those years?" She thought for a moment, then said, "The thought that someone, somewhere, needed what I was making, that what I did mattered, even if no one saw it." The interviewer asked another question. "Do you ever regret the years you spent in the factory?" She shook her head slowly. "No. Those years taught me the meaning of strength. Not the kind you see in soldiers or leaders, the kind that comes when the world tells you to give up, and you don't. The world tells you to give up, and you don't." In another part of the world, an old woman named Clara Jenkins was doing the same interview for an American project. When asked what she remembered most, she smiled faintly and said, "The sound of the rivet gun. It was loud, but comforting. It meant we were alive, and we were helping." That sound was hope. They never met, Margaret and Clara. Yet their words echoed each other across oceans. Two lives bound by a war that had changed everything. And so it was that when historians spoke of World War II, of battles and generals, of invasions and empires, there were always a few who remembered to mention the other side of victory. The hands that built it, the hearts that sustained it, the ordinary civilians who turned courage into machinery and sweat into freedom. Their war was not fought in trenches or skies, but in workshops and kitchens, in ration lines and assembly lines. It was a war of endurance, of quiet heroism, of millions of unsung victories. And though the world moved on, the ghosts of that effort remained. In every humming engine, every rebuilt city, every generation born free, because someone, somewhere, had refused to stop turning the wheel. Years passed, and peace grew old. The world rebuilt itself in steel and concrete. But beneath the new roads and towers, memories of the war lay buried like roots that still fed the present. By the 1950s, Coventry was no longer a city of ruins. New buildings rose beside the shattered cathedral, left standing as a monument to endurance. Margaret would walk by it often, the contrast always catching her breath. Old stone and new glass, grief and rebirth side by side. She was 40 now, her hair streaked with silver, her back still strong from years at the machines. The engineering school where she taught had grown into a proper college. Her students were no longer men suspicious of her authority. They were boys who had grown up in peace, who listened to her stories with reverence. Sometimes she would show them her old lathe gloves, stiff with oil and time, and say, "These built your world, lads. Never forget who held the tools before you." One student once asked her, "Do you ever wish you'd done something different? Something gentler?" She thought about it for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "Gentle things don't last on their own. Someone has to build the strength to protect them." On the other side of the Atlantic, Clara's world had changed too. The garage she'd started after the war was now the largest service shop in town. A painted sign above the door read Jenkins and Sons, though she never had children. The sons were her apprentices, boys from nearby farms, some troublemakers, some dreamers. She taught them all the same way she'd learned herself, with patience, precision, and pride. By the late 1950s, the war was something seen in newsreels, not memories. But sometimes, late at night, when the radio played the old swing tunes of the 40s, Clara would pause her work and feel a strange ache. Nostalgia not for the war itself, but for the unity it had brought, for the sense of purpose that had burned in every heart and home. Peace, for all its blessings, was lonelier. In 1961, a letter came from an air museum in Washington, inviting her to attend a ceremony honoring the women who had worked in aircraft production. She almost didn't go. "I just built things," she told James. "They were the ones who flew and fought." But he insisted. "You built the wings that carried them," he said. "You deserve to see what that means." The ceremony was small but heartfelt. In a hangar filled with restored bombers, women with gray hair and lined faces stood shoulder to shoulder again, their laughter echoing like it once did across factory floors. Some recognized each other instantly. Others just knew by instinct that they had shared the same years of noise and sweat. Clara stood beneath the wing of a gleaming B-24 and touched the rivets with trembling fingers. "I put some of you in myself," she whispered. The curator saw her touch the metal and smiled. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Clara nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "We built her to end a war, but now she just looks peaceful. Maybe that's how it should be." Back in England, Margaret too found herself drawn to remembrance. The post-war years had carried her into a quieter life, teaching, reading, tending to her mother's garden. Yet the past never truly faded. Every Remembrance Day, she still pinned her brother's wings to her coat and joined the crowds in silence. As the bugles played, she thought not only of soldiers, but of the women who had held the line behind them. The factory workers, the nurses, the farmers, the mechanics. The unseen army. In 1963, the college asked her to give a speech to mark the opening of a new engineering wing. She stood at the podium, her voice clear but gentle. "You'll learn to shape metal here," she told the students, "but never forget, every machine begins with a reason. In my time, the reason was survival. In yours, it may be progress or peace. Whatever it is, make it worthy of your hands." When she finished, the room was silent. Then the applause came. Long, deep, and grateful. In the years that followed, both women lived quieter lives, but their influence rippled outward. Margaret's apprentices became engineers and builders, carrying her lessons across Britain's reborn industries. Clara's mechanics opened shops of their own, their walls hung with old wartime posters. "We can do it," faded to soft yellow with time, but never forgotten. Sometimes, when Margaret could no longer sleep, she would sit by her window and listen to the faint hum of distant trains. It reminded her of the factory floor, of the machines that once thundered through the night. That sound, mechanical yet human, had been the heartbeat of an era. "We made so much noise," she said once to a friend. But what mattered was what the noise meant. The decades slipped by like pages in a book. By the 1970s, the war was history. Young people spoke of it with awe but little understanding. When journalists asked veterans for stories, they turned mostly to the men who had fought. Few asked about those who had built behind them, but those who remembered, the survivors. The families knew the truth. Victory had been forged not only in battlefields, but in factories, kitchens, and hearts. Clara's health began to fail in the late 1970s. She closed her garage at last, selling it to one of her apprentices, a kind young man who promised to keep the name. On her last day there, she stood in the empty bay, sunlight streaming through the windows onto the oil-stained floor. "Good girl," she murmured to the building, patting the wall like an old friend. "You did your part." A few years later, in 1982, Margaret visited the Imperial War Museum in London for the first time. She walked slowly through exhibits of tanks, aircraft, and uniforms until she reached the small section dedicated to home front workers. There, among the photographs, she saw faces she recognized, young women in overalls, smiling through soot and fatigue. Beneath the display was a quote engraved in brass. "They built the strength of nations, one shift at a time." She stood before it for a long while, her reflection mingling with theirs in the glass. When she finally turned away, there were tears in her eyes. But they were not of sadness. They were gratitude for having lived through something that had shown her what people were capable of when the world demanded everything they had. In her last years, she moved to a small cottage by the sea. The air was quieter there, the nights filled with the sound of waves instead of engines. She kept one small shelf of mementos, her brother's photo, her old work badge, and the letter Elsie had once given her. "For my boy who never came home, I work for yours." She read it often, her fingers tracing the fading ink. When Margaret Holloway passed away in 1987, the local newspaper published a short obituary. Former factory worker and educator, known for her service during the Second World War. It was a modest line for an extraordinary life, but perhaps fitting. She would have wanted it that way. In America, Clara lived a few years longer. Her funeral in 1991 drew an entire town. Mechanics, veterans, and students who had grown up hearing her stories. The local paper described her as the woman who built her way through history. At the service, one of her former apprentices spoke. "She taught us that even the smallest job can be great if you do it with pride. She built engines, but she also built people." Time, as always, moved on. The century turned. The last of that generation began to fade, their stories tucked into archives and family albums. But in every museum, in every photograph of smiling women in factory uniforms, in every engine that carried the weight of freedom, their legacy remained. Somewhere in Coventry, in a classroom that bore her name, a teacher still told students about the war years, about the women who had kept the world turning. And in a small town in Michigan, the garage still stood, its sign repainted but unchanged. Jenkins and Sons. On its back wall hung a framed photograph of a young woman with rolled-up sleeves, standing before a bomber with a rivet gun in hand. Beneath it, a small brass plate read simply, "She helped build victory." The war had ended long ago, but its true front lines, the invisible ones, the ones fought in sweat and silence, would never fade. The civilians who built the war had left behind more than machines. They had built proof that courage need not wear a uniform, that heroism can live in ordinary hearts, and that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can be forged from labor, hope, and love. And so the sound of their world, the hum of the lathe, the clang of the rivet, the murmur of voices over rationed tea, still echoes faintly across history, a quiet song beneath the roar of victory. Decades turned into the quiet hum of a new century. The factories that once shook with the thunder of engines were gone now, replaced by glass offices and retail stores. Yet sometimes, on still nights, the wind that swept through the empty industrial districts seemed to carry faint echoes. The rhythm of hammers, the laughter of women on night shifts, the distant call of a foreman shouting orders above the din. History had settled, but it had not fallen silent. In Coventry, where Margaret had once worked the lathe until her hands bled, the city council erected a small memorial in 2005. It wasn't grand, just a bronze plaque set into a wall of red brick, surrounded by flowers. The inscription read, "To those who built what others fought for, to those who labored so freedom might stand." Every November, school children came with paper poppies and candles. Some knew the story, others only the name. But when the guide told them of the women who built planes and engines in the dark years of war, they would grow quiet, imagining the clang of metal and the courage it took to keep going when the sirens wailed. One of those children was a girl named Emily, 12 years old, bright-eyed, curious. She had found an old black-and-white photo in her grandmother's attic. A group of women in overalls, grease on their faces, smiling beside an unfinished aircraft wing. In the back row, Second from the left, her grandmother stood, young, strong, and proud. The discovery set Emily's mind ablaze. She began to ask questions, to read books, to listen to the stories that were fading from living memory. They were heroes, too, she told her teacher one day. Just the kind nobody wrote songs about. In America, the old Jenkins garage still stood. The paint had peeled, the tools had changed, but the sign remained the same. A young mechanic named Luke ran it now. The grandson of one of Clara's apprentices, he kept her photograph framed above the main workbench. She built planes in the war, he would tell customers. My granddad said she could fix anything, even a broken heart. Every Veterans Day, he wiped the picture clean and placed a small American flag beside it. Not out of ceremony, but respect. Sometimes, school groups would visit, guided by local historians tracing the town's contribution to the war effort. They would stand in that garage, inhaling the scent of oil and metal, while Luke told them how a woman named Clara once riveted bombers by day and fixed trucks by night, how she'd kept going through exhaustion, through rationing, through doubt, because the world needed her hands. The students always listened in silence, then left with a look that said they understood, maybe for the first time, that heroism wasn't always loud. Across the sea, at the Imperial War Museum in London, Margaret's photograph was added to a new exhibit in 2010, The Home Front, Strength Beyond the Battlefields. The curator had found her story through a surviving student of hers, who'd kept her notes and letters. The picture showed her standing in front of a lathe, sleeves rolled up, face streaked with sweat and pride. Beneath it, the caption read, Margaret Holloway, machine operator and educator, 1941–1945. We made noise, but what mattered was what the noise meant. Visitors often lingered before that photo. Some wept softly, others simply smiled, recognizing in her eyes the same quiet determination that had once held the world together. For the museum's staff, she became a symbol, not of victory, but of continuity. By 2020, few who had worked through those years were still alive. But their legacy was everywhere, in the freedoms people took for granted, in the equality movements that had begun with women's factory work, in the way ordinary people now believed that collective effort could change the world. The home front had laid the foundation for everything that came after. One evening, Emily, now grown, now a filmmaker, stood in that same museum, preparing to shoot the final scene of her documentary about the women who built the war. Around her were the echoes of their world, black and white footage, factory sounds remastered for sound design, the ghostly hum of an age when courage wore coveralls and calloused hands. She spoke softly to her camera as it rolled, her voice carrying both awe and tenderness. They didn't fight with rifles or commands, she said. They fought with will, with every turn of a wrench, every sleepless night, every meal given up for someone else. They didn't seek glory, but without them, victory would have been hollow. These were the builders of freedom, unseen, unsung, but unforgettable. The light in the museum dimmed as the crew packed up, but Emily stayed a while longer. She approached Margaret's photograph and placed a single paper flower beneath it, one she'd made with her daughter the night before. For all of you, she whispered. For all of us. As she left, the automatic doors opened, and a gust of cold evening air swept through the hall. It rustled the display panels, stirred a faint scent of metal polish, and for a fleeting second, it sounded like the hum of a factory waking up again. Outside, the city lights glowed against the night, reflections shimmering like sparks across glass and steel. The world they had built, through toil, sacrifice, and love, still stood, alive and shining. And somewhere, deep within that glow, the spirit of those civilians, those ordinary giants, lived on. In every bridge crossed, every engine started, every dream that dared to rise from the ashes of war. The story of the war they built was not just history. It was inheritance. It was proof that courage needs no battlefield, only hands willing to shape hope from the hardest of times. And so their song remains, faint but eternal. The rhythm of hammers, the whisper of turning wheels, the heartbeat of a world they built so others could live in peace. So others could live in peace.